Arnold carries man out of flood after neighbor leaves him to drown. The storm had been brewing for days, but no one in the small rural town could have predicted how devastating it would become. By the time the first floodwaters breached the riverbanks, entire neighborhoods were submerged, and the once quiet streets had turned into torrents of rushing water. Trees groaned under the weight of the wind, their roots ripping free from the saturated earth, and power lines sparked and hissed as they toppled into the water. The sound of the storm was deafening, a relentless roar that drowned out cries for help. In the heart of it all was Daniel, a young man in his late 20s, trapped in a single-story house that was rapidly filling with water. He had moved to the area only 6 months ago, hoping for a fresh start after losing his job in the city. But now, as he stood knee-deep in the murky floodwater that had already engulfed most of his living room, he realized how isolated he truly was. The power was out, his phone had no signal, and the only sounds were the storm outside and the ominous creaking of his walls as the rising water pressed against them. "Help!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. He pounded on the walls, hoping someone, anyone, outside might hear him. But his cries were swallowed by the storm, leaving him alone with the rising waters and the sinking dread in his chest. Outside, the floodwaters surged higher, carrying with them debris from shattered homes and uprooted trees. Daniel's neighbors had fled earlier in the day, packing their cars and heading for higher ground. He had stayed behind, thinking the storm wouldn't be as bad as the news had predicted. Now he was paying the price for his stubbornness. Through the shattered window of his living room, Daniel could see the house next door, a 2-story structure that still had its lights on, thanks to a backup generator. He knew the owner, a man named Carl, who had always been standoffish and dismissive. Carl had made it clear from the moment Daniel moved in that he didn't like having outsiders in the neighborhood. The man's cold demeanor had only worsened in the weeks leading up to the storm, and Daniel had given up trying to be friendly. Now, as Daniel watched the lights flicker in Carl's house, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Carl hadn't left yet. Maybe he could help. Summoning what little strength he had left, Daniel waded toward the window and shouted, "Carl, Carl, can you hear me? I need help." There was no response. Daniel shouted again, his voice cracking with desperation. "Carl, please, I'm trapped in here. The water's rising." For a moment, he thought he saw movement in one of Carl's upstairs windows, a shadow passing by the curtains. His heart leapt. "Carl!" he screamed, waving his arms. "I'm over here. Please, help me." The shadow paused, and Daniel's breath hitched. He was sure someone was looking at him, watching him struggle in the flood. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow disappeared. The curtain fell back into place, and the light in the window went dark. Daniel's heart sank. He couldn't believe it. Carl had seen him, had heard his cries for help, and yet he had turned his back. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest, leaving him gasping for air. He was truly alone. The water was now up to his waist, cold and relentless as it swirled around him. Pieces of furniture floated by, his coffee table, a lamp, a framed photo of his family, all carried away by the current. He tried to stay calm, but the panic was overwhelming. His house wouldn't hold much longer. If he didn't find a way out soon, he'd drown. As he struggled to keep his balance against the current, he heard a faint sound over the roar of the storm. It was deep and rhythmic, cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. At first, he thought it might be the hum of a distant motorboat, but as it grew louder, he realized it was something else, something closer. A voice, a deep, commanding voice that carried with it a sense of authority and determination. "Is anyone there?" the voice called, booming over the wind and rain. "If you're trapped, call out." Daniel's heart leapt. "Here," he shouted, his voice breaking with relief. "I'm here." The sound of heavy footsteps sloshing through the water grew closer. Daniel turned toward the window, his eyes straining to see through the rain and darkness. What he saw made his jaw drop. A man emerged from the storm, his broad shoulders and powerful frame cutting an imposing silhouette against the chaos. He was wearing a drenched red shirt that clung to his muscular build, and his face was set with an expression of grim determination. His movements were purposeful, his steps unyielding as he pushed through the chest-deep water with ease. It was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Daniel could hardly believe his eyes. He recognized the man instantly, not just because of his unmistakable physique, but because of who he was. Arnold was a legend, a larger-than-life figure whose name carried weight in every corner of the world. And now, here he was, trudging through the floodwaters of a tiny rural town to rescue a stranger. "Stay where you are," Arnold shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. "I'm coming to get you." Daniel felt a surge of hope unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He watched as Arnold made his way closer, his powerful arms clearing debris from his path. The man's strength was almost superhuman, his movements steady and deliberate despite the raging current. As Arnold approached the house, he stopped briefly to assess the situation. His sharp eyes scanned the structure, taking in the rising water, the broken windows, and the sagging walls. Without hesitation, he turned back to Daniel and shouted, "Can you move? Are you injured?" "I'm not hurt," Daniel called back, his voice trembling. "But the water's rising fast. I can't get out." Arnold nodded, his expression unwavering. "Hold on," he said. "I'll get you out of there." Arnold moved through the water with the kind of determination Daniel had only ever seen in movies. Every step seemed deliberate, his legs cutting through the current as if the floodwaters were no match for him. The closer he got, the more surreal it felt to Daniel. How could someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger, action hero, former governor, international icon, be standing in his yard, braving a flood to rescue him? Arnold reached the edge of Daniel's porch, which was almost completely submerged, and braced himself against the rising current. The floodwaters surged around him, carrying debris that battered against his legs, but he didn't flinch. His hands gripped the sagging wooden railing as he leaned forward, calling out to Daniel. "I'm going to need you to stay calm," Arnold said, his deep voice cutting through the roar of the storm. "Can you make it to the door? Or do I need to come inside?" Daniel glanced down at the water swirling around his waist. The room was a disaster. Furniture overturned, waterlogged belongings bobbing around like driftwood, but he still had enough balance to move. "I think I can make it," he shouted back, his voice shaky but determined. "Good," Arnold replied, giving him a firm nod. "Move carefully. Don't rush. I've got you." Daniel's legs felt like lead as he started toward the door. The water fought him with every step, pulling at his body and threatening to knock him off balance. He grabbed onto the edge of a floating chair for support, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he forced himself forward. The closer he got to the door, the more treacherous it became. The current outside was stronger than he'd realized, and the water at his feet was littered with sharp debris, shards of glass, splinters of wood, even the remnants of a broken picture frame. When he finally reached the door, Arnold was there to steady him. The man's hands were massive, his grip firm but careful as he helped Daniel climb out of the house and onto the partially submerged porch. For a brief moment, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He was out of the house, no longer trapped. But that relief was short-lived. The water was deeper than he'd realized. Arnold stood chest-deep in the flood, his legs braced against the current. But Daniel's smaller frame left him far more vulnerable. The moment he stepped into the water, he felt the full force of it pulling at him, dragging him sideways. He let out a startled cry as his feet slipped, his body lurching toward the current. "I've got you," Arnold barked, his voice commanding. His arms shot out, catching Daniel just before he went under. With one powerful motion, Arnold pulled him upright, his grip like a vice. "Stay close to me. The water's stronger than it looks." Daniel nodded, too shaken to speak. He clung to Arnold's arm as the man guided him toward higher ground, their progress slow but steady. The current was relentless, tugging at their bodies with every step, but Arnold didn't falter. His movements were deliberate, his focus unshakable as he shielded Daniel from the worst of the debris and kept them moving forward. As they waded through the water, Daniel couldn't help but glance toward Carl's house. The two-story structure loomed in the distance, its lights still dark, its windows shuttered. There was no sign of movement inside, no sign that Carl had even bothered to check if Daniel was okay. The memory of that shadow in the upstairs window burned in Daniel's mind, a cruel reminder of just how easily his neighbor had abandoned him. He looked back at Arnold, who was now using his free hand to push a large branch out of their path. "Why are you here?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" Arnold glanced at him, his expression calm but serious. "Because someone had to," he said simply. "I was passing through when I saw the flood. People were in trouble, and I couldn't just stand by." Daniel stared at him, his chest tightening. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Arnold said them with such quiet conviction. This wasn't about fame or recognition. Arnold was here because he believed it was the right thing to do. Before Daniel could respond, a surge of water slammed into them, nearly knocking him off his feet again. Arnold's grip tightened instantly, his arm wrapping around Daniel's waist to keep him upright. "Careful," Arnold barked, his voice sharp. The currents picking up. Daniel nodded, his heart pounding as he clung to Arnold's side. The water was rising faster now, the wind whipping around them in furious gusts. In the distance, they could hear the creaking and groaning of collapsing structures as the flood claimed more of the neighborhood. It was a grim reminder of just how precarious their situation was. "Where are we going?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Arnold pointed toward a distant patch of higher ground, where a cluster of emergency vehicles was parked. The flashing lights of ambulances and fire trucks cut through the darkness, a beacon of hope in the chaos. "There," Arnold said, "but we've got to move fast. The water's not going to wait for us." They pressed on, the journey becoming more treacherous with every step. The floodwaters were a minefield of hidden dangers, and Arnold was constantly scanning their path for obstacles. At one point, he stopped abruptly, holding Daniel back as a large piece of debris, a shattered section of a wooden fence, floated past them. "Watch your step," Arnold said, his voice steady. "We're almost there," but almost wasn't close enough. The water was now up to Daniel's chest, and the strain of the journey was beginning to take its toll. His legs felt like jelly, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as the cold sapped his strength. He stumbled again, his body lurching sideways, but Arnold caught him easily, his grip never faltering. "Stay with me," Arnold said, his tone both commanding and reassuring. "You're doing good. Just a little further." Daniel nodded weakly, his mind focused on one thing, putting one foot in front of the other. He could feel the weight of Arnold's arm around him, the man's strength anchoring him against the relentless pull of the current. It was the only thing keeping him going, the only thing keeping him alive. Arnold moved through the water with the kind of determination Daniel had only ever seen in movies. Every step seemed deliberate, his legs cutting through the current as if the floodwaters were no match for him. The closer he got, the more surreal it felt to Daniel. How could someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger, action hero, former governor, international icon, be standing in his yard, braving a flood to rescue him? Arnold reached the edge of Daniel's porch, which was almost completely submerged, and braced himself against the rising current. The floodwaters surged around him, carrying debris that battered against his legs, but he didn't flinch. His hands gripped the sagging wooden railing as he leaned forward, calling out to Daniel. "I'm going to need you to stay calm," Arnold said, his deep voice cutting through the roar of the storm. "Can you make it to the door? Or do I need to come inside?" Daniel glanced down at the water swirling around his waist. The room was a disaster. Furniture overturned, waterlogged belongings bobbing around like driftwood, but he still had enough balance to move. "I think I can make it," he shouted back, his voice shaky but determined. "Good," Arnold replied, giving him a firm nod. "Move carefully. Don't rush. I've got you." Daniel's legs felt like lead as he started toward the door. The water fought him with every step, pulling at his body and threatening to knock him off balance. He grabbed onto the edge of a floating chair for support, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he forced himself forward. The closer he got to the door, the more treacherous it became. The current outside was stronger than he'd realized, and the water at his feet was littered with sharp debris, shards of glass, splinters of wood, even the remnants of a broken picture frame. When he finally reached the door, Arnold was there to steady him. The man's hands were massive, his grip firm but careful as he helped Daniel climb out of the house and onto the partially submerged porch. For a brief moment, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He was out of the house, no longer trapped. But that relief was short-lived. The water was deeper than he'd realized. Arnold stood chest-deep in the flood, his legs braced against the current. But Daniel's smaller frame left him far more vulnerable. The moment he stepped into the water, he felt the full force of it pulling at him, dragging him sideways. He let out a startled cry as his feet slipped, his body lurching toward the current. "I've got you," Arnold barked, his voice commanding. His arms shot out, catching Daniel just before he went under. With one powerful motion, Arnold pulled him upright, his grip like a vice. "Stay close to me. The water's stronger than it looks." Daniel nodded, too shaken to speak. He clung to Arnold's arm as the man guided him toward higher ground, their progress slow but steady. The current was relentless, tugging at their bodies with every step, but Arnold didn't falter. His movements were deliberate, his focus unshakable as he shielded Daniel from the worst of the debris and kept them moving forward. As they waded through the water, Daniel couldn't help but glance toward Carl's house. The two-story structure loomed in the distance, its lights still dark, its windows shuttered. There was no sign of movement inside, no sign that Carl had even bothered to check if Daniel was okay. The memory of that shadow in the upstairs window burned in Daniel's mind, a cruel reminder of just how easily his neighbor had abandoned him. He looked back at Arnold, who was now using his free hand to push a large branch out of their path. "Why are you here?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" Arnold glanced at him, his expression calm but serious. "Because someone had to," he said simply. "I was passing through when I saw the flood. People were in trouble, and I couldn't just stand by." Daniel stared at him, his chest tightening. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Arnold said them with such quiet conviction. This wasn't about fame or recognition. Arnold was here because he believed it was the right thing to do. Before Daniel could respond, a surge of water slammed into them, nearly knocking him off his feet again. Arnold's grip tightened instantly, his arm wrapping around Daniel's waist to keep him upright. "Careful," Arnold barked, his voice sharp. "The current's picking up." Daniel nodded, his heart pounding as he clung to Arnold's side. The water was rising faster now, the wind whipping around them in furious gusts. In the distance, they could hear the creaking and groaning of collapsing structures as the flood claimed more of the neighborhood. It was a grim reminder of just how precarious their situation was. "Where are we going?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Arnold pointed toward a distant patch of higher ground, where a cluster of emergency vehicles was parked. The flashing lights of ambulances and fire trucks cut through the darkness, a beacon of hope in the chaos. "There," Arnold said, "but we've got to move fast. The water's not going to wait for us." They pressed on, the journey becoming more treacherous with every step. The floodwaters were a minefield of hidden dangers, and Arnold was constantly scanning their path for obstacles. At one point, he stopped abruptly, holding Daniel back as a large piece of debris, a shattered section of a wooden fence, floated past them. "Watch your step," Arnold said, his voice steady. "We're almost there," but almost wasn't close enough. The water was now up to Daniel's chest, and the strain of the journey was beginning to take its toll. His legs felt like jelly, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as the cold sapped his strength. He stumbled again, his body lurching sideways, but Arnold caught him easily, his grip never faltering. "Stay with me," Arnold said, his tone both commanding and reassuring. "You're doing good. Just a little further." Daniel nodded weakly, his mind focused on one thing, putting one foot in front of the other. He could feel the weight of Arnold's arm around him, the man's strength anchoring him against the relentless pull of the current. It was the only thing keeping him going, the only thing keeping him alive. The sound of the storm was deafening now, a relentless roar of wind and water that drowned out nearly everything else. Arnold moved with the same deliberate determination, his broad shoulders cutting through the rushing current like a battering ram. Daniel clung to his side, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as the water rose higher and higher, now reaching his collarbone. "Keep moving," Arnold said, his deep voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Don't stop, no matter what. I've got you." Daniel nodded, though his body was trembling from both fear and exhaustion. His legs were weak, barely able to fight against the current that threatened to sweep him away with every step. Each movement felt like a battle, the floodwaters pushing back against him as if trying to drag him under. He glanced over his shoulder at his house, now almost completely submerged, the roof barely visible above the waterline. It was a sobering sight, a stark reminder of how close he had come to being trapped inside. As they pushed forward, Daniel's thoughts turned back to Carl. The memory of that shadow in the upstairs window, the brief flicker of light before it disappeared, filled him with a bitter sense of betrayal. Carl had seen him, he was sure of it, and yet the man had done nothing. He had ignored Daniel's desperate cries for help, leaving him to fend for himself while the floodwaters rose. "Why didn't he help me?" Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Arnold glanced at him, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Who?" "Carl," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "My neighbor. I saw him, he was home. He knew I was in trouble, and he just ignored me." Arnold's jaw tightened, his expression hardening. He didn't respond immediately, his focus remaining on the path ahead as he scanned for debris and obstacles. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but firm. "Some people can't handle pressure," he said. "They freeze or they look the other way. It's not right, but it happens." Daniel clenched his fists, his chest tightening with anger and frustration. "He didn't even try," he said, his voice trembling. "He could have done something, anything, but he didn't. He just left me there." Arnold didn't say anything, but Daniel could see the flicker of disapproval in his eyes. It wasn't just the flood that had turned dangerous. It was the realization that, in moments of crisis, people could reveal their true selves. For Carl, that truth was ugly and selfish, and it stung more than Daniel wanted to admit. They pressed on, the journey growing more treacherous with every step. The current was stronger now, the water surging around them like a living thing, pulling at their legs and threatening to drag them under. The higher ground, with its distant flashing lights, still felt impossibly far away. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the air, followed by the groaning sound of splintering wood. Both Arnold and Daniel turned toward the noise, their eyes widening as they saw what was happening. One of the larger houses in the neighborhood, a two-story structure that had stood firm for decades, was beginning to collapse under the weight of the floodwaters. The foundation gave way with a deafening crack, sending the entire structure crashing into the water in a cloud of debris and spray. "Move!" Arnold shouted, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. He grabbed Daniel by the arm, pulling him forward as the debris from the collapsing house began to spread through the current. Large pieces of wood and metal floated toward them, carried by the rushing water like deadly projectiles. Daniel stumbled, his feet slipping on the uneven ground beneath the floodwaters. He felt Arnold's grip tighten, steadying him as they waded through the torrent. "Watch your step," Arnold barked. "Stay close to me." A large beam floated past them, spinning wildly in the current. Arnold grabbed it with one hand, his powerful grip stopping it mid-spin before he shoved it aside, clearing the path. "Keep moving," he shouted, his voice firm. "We're not stopping here." Daniel nodded, his chest heaving as he fought to keep up. The cold water sapped his strength, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. Every step was a struggle, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like a physical force. He wanted to stop, to collapse and let the current take him, but Arnold's presence kept him moving. The man's sheer determination was infectious, a driving force that pushed Daniel forward even when his body wanted to give up. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicles were closer now, but the path to safety was far from clear. The floodwaters were filled with debris, broken fences, shattered furniture, even an overturned car that bobbed in the distance like a lifeboat gone adrift. Arnold moved with precision, his sharp eyes scanning the water for any signs of danger. He used his free arm to push obstacles aside, his strength cutting a path through the chaos. Almost there, Arnold said, his voice steady but urgent. Just a little further. Daniel nodded weakly, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. His body was on the verge of collapse, every muscle screaming in protest. But he kept moving, his focus fixed on the lights ahead. The sound of the storm seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding of his heartbeat in his ears. Just as they reached a clearer section of water, something caught Arnold's attention. His head snapped to the side, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a figure clinging to a piece of debris a few yards away. It was a man, his face pale and terrified as he held onto the floating wood for dear life. The man's eyes met Arnold's, and he let out a hoarse cry for help. Arnold stopped abruptly, his grip on Daniel tightening as he assessed the situation. The man was trapped in a swirling eddy, the current spinning him in place as he struggled to hold on. His position was precarious, the debris beneath him threatening to give way at any moment. "We have to get him," Arnold said, his voice firm. Daniel's heart sank. He knew what Arnold was about to do, and he also knew how dangerous it would be. The current was already treacherous enough, and going after the man would put both of them at even greater risk. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Arnold looked at him, his expression unwavering. "We don't leave people behind," he said simply. "Stay close to me, and we'll get through this." The storm showed no mercy as Arnold forged ahead, his powerful frame acting as a shield against the relentless current. The floodwaters churned around them, cold and unforgiving, as pieces of shattered debris floated past with alarming speed. Daniel stumbled after him, his legs heavy and unsteady, his lungs burning with every breath. The man Arnold had rescued hung limply in his arms, his head lolling as exhaustion and shock took their toll. "Keep moving," Arnold shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're almost there. Almost." The word rang hollow in Daniel's mind. The emergency vehicles were closer now, their flashing lights cutting through the gloom, but the floodwaters were deeper, faster, and more treacherous than ever. Every step felt like a battle, the current pulling at their legs and threatening to sweep them off their feet. The path ahead was a minefield of obstacles, broken fences, jagged branches, and the wreckage of a capsized boat that had been swept into the neighborhood. "Stay behind me," Arnold barked, his tone sharp but commanding. He adjusted his grip on the man in his arms, holding him with one powerful arm while using the other to push aside a large piece of debris. The water surged around him, but he didn't falter. His movements were deliberate, his focus unwavering. Daniel tried to obey, but his strength was waning. The cold had seeped into his bones, sapping what little energy he had left. His legs ached with every step, his muscles screaming in protest as he struggled to keep up. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps, each one a reminder of how close he was to his limit. I can't," Daniel gasped, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Arnold snapped, turning to look at him. His eyes were fierce, filled with determination. "You're not giving up. Not here, not now. You're stronger than you think. So keep moving." Daniel nodded weakly, though his body felt like it was on the verge of collapse. Arnold's words were a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink. He focused on the man's massive frame, using it as a guide as he forced himself forward, one agonizing step at a time. Suddenly, a loud, metallic screech tore through the air. Daniel's head snapped up, his heart pounding as he searched for the source of the noise. His eyes widened in horror as he saw it. A massive propane tank, dislodged by the floodwaters, was tumbling toward them. The tank bounced off the wreckage of a submerged car, spinning wildly as it was carried by the current. "Get down!" Arnold bellowed, his voice filled with urgency. He shoved Daniel behind him, his free arm bracing against the tank as it hurtled toward them. The impact was bone-jarring, the force of it sending a shockwave through the water. Arnold gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he held the tank in place, preventing it from crashing into Daniel. With a powerful shove, Arnold redirected the tank, sending it spinning off into the current. It collided with a tree trunk further downstream, the impact sending a spray of water into the air. Arnold straightened, his chest heaving as he turned back to Daniel. "You okay?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Daniel nodded, though his hands were trembling. "Yeah," he croaked, his voice shaky. I'm fine." Arnold didn't waste time on further reassurance. He adjusted his grip on the rescued man, then motioned for Daniel to follow. "Stay close," he said. "The worst is behind us, but we're not out of this yet." Daniel wasn't sure if he believed him, but he obeyed, his legs moving on autopilot as he trudged after Arnold. The water was almost chest-deep now, the current stronger than ever. Each step felt like a gamble, the ground beneath them uneven and treacherous. But Arnold moved with purpose, his every action calculated to keep them alive. As they pressed on, the lights of the emergency vehicles grew brighter, the sounds of shouting voices cutting through the storm. Daniel felt a flicker of hope, an ember of possibility that they might actually make it out of this. But that hope was short-lived. Another sound cut through the air, low and ominous. It was a deep, rumbling groan, like the earth itself was shifting beneath them. Daniel turned toward the noise, his heart sinking as he saw what was happening. A massive tree, its roots loosened by the floodwaters, was beginning to collapse. The trunk leaned precariously, its branches tangled with power lines that sparked and hissed in the rain. The tree teetered for a moment, then gave way with a deafening crack, crashing into the water just a few yards ahead of them. "Move!" Arnold shouted, his voice like thunder. He grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him back as the tree sent waves of water surging toward them. The force of the waves nearly knocked Daniel off his feet, but Arnold's grip kept him upright. The tree settled into the water, its massive branches blocking their path. Arnold surveyed the obstacle, his jaw tightening as he assessed their options. The current was too strong to go around it, and the branches were too thick to climb over. "We'll go through," Arnold said, his tone resolute. "Through," Daniel repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "Are you serious? That thing could collapse at any second." Arnold glanced at him, his expression calm but unyielding. "It's the only way," he said. "Stay close to me and don't stop moving. We'll make it." Daniel wanted to argue, but there was no time. The storm was relentless, the floodwaters rising with every passing moment. He took a deep breath, steeling himself as he followed Arnold toward the fallen tree. The branches were like a maze, their sharp edges catching on Daniel's clothes as he squeezed through the narrow gaps. The water was swirling faster here, the current pulling at his legs as if trying to drag him back. He stumbled again, his hands gripping the slick bark of the tree for balance. Arnold moved ahead of him, his powerful arms clearing the path with ease. The rescued man hung limply in his grip, his head lolling as Arnold carried him through the branches. "Keep up," Arnold called, his voice sharp. "We're almost through." Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing himself forward. The lights of the emergency vehicles were just on the other side of the tree, so close yet so far. Every step felt like a battle, the weight of exhaustion threatening to pull him under. The tangled branches of the fallen tree were a labyrinth of jagged edges and slick surfaces, each step through them feeling more precarious than the last. The current surged around the base of the tree, threatening to knock Daniel off his feet with every movement. Arnold moved ahead of him with purpose, his strength and focus unwavering as he cleared the path. The unconscious man he carried seemed like dead weight, but Arnold bore him with the ease of someone who had long since mastered the art of endurance. "Stay close," Arnold shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. The fallen tree groaned under its own weight, the branches swaying dangerously as the floodwaters pulled at them. Sparks erupted from the power lines tangled above, sending arcs of light across the darkened sky. Daniel could barely see through the sheets of rain and swirling debris, but he followed Arnold as closely as he could, his hands gripping the branches for balance. Each step felt like a gamble, the slick wood threatening to give way beneath him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. "Don't stop," Arnold barked, glancing back at Daniel. His sharp eyes assessed the younger man's shaky movements, his expression hardening. "You can do this, just one step at a time." Daniel nodded weakly, though his legs felt like they would give out at any moment. He kept his focus on Arnold, the man's massive frame a beacon of strength in the chaos. The branches creaked and groaned under their weight, the sound a grim reminder of how unstable their path was. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air. Daniel's head snapped up, his heart sinking as he saw one of the larger branches above them splintering under the pressure of the tangled power lines. The branch leaned dangerously to one side, its weight pulling the wires tighter and tighter. Sparks rained down like fireworks, the sharp smell of burning ozone cutting through the damp air. "Arnold!" Daniel shouted, his voice trembling. "The branch! It's about to fall!" Arnold looked up, his jaw tightening as he assessed the situation. The branch was massive, its thick limbs twisted around the power lines like a noose. If it fell, it would come crashing down directly in their path, taking out anything and anyone in its way. "Move faster," Arnold ordered, his tone sharp. He shifted the unconscious man in his arms, adjusting his grip as he quickened his pace. The floodwaters surged around him, but he didn't slow down, his powerful strides cutting through the current with ease. Daniel tried to keep up, but the path ahead was a nightmare of jagged branches and rushing water. His foot slipped on the slick wood, and he stumbled, his hands scraping against the bark as he struggled to regain his balance. His chest heaved with the effort, his muscles screaming in protest. "Get up!" Arnold's voice was a lifeline, pulling Daniel back from the brink. "You're stronger than this. Now move." With a surge of determination, Daniel pushed himself forward, his hands and feet scrambling over the twisted branches. The fallen tree groaned beneath him, the sound reverberating through the floodwaters like a warning. He could feel the vibrations in his bones, each creak and crack a reminder of how precarious their position was. Arnold was almost to the other side, the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles casting his silhouette in sharp relief. The unconscious man in his arms was slumped against his chest, his head lolling as Arnold carried him through the final stretch. But the collapsing branch above was a ticking time bomb, its weight pulling harder on the power lines with every passing second. Just as Arnold reached the edge of the tree, the inevitable happened. The branch above gave way with a deafening crack, snapping free from the power lines and plummeting toward the ground. Sparks erupted in a blinding flash, the sound of the snapping lines like a whip cracking through the storm. "Daniel, get down!" Arnold roared, his voice booming over the chaos. Daniel didn't have time to think. He dropped to his knees, pressing himself against the slick branches as the massive limb crashed into the water just feet away from him. The impact sent a wave of water surging over the fallen tree, the force of it nearly knocking him off. He gripped the branches tightly, his knuckles white as he fought to stay in place. When the wave subsided, Daniel lifted his head, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The branch had created a new barrier in their path, its thick limbs tangled with the rest of the fallen tree. The water around it churned violently, the current pulling at the debris like a hungry beast. Arnold was on the other side, his powerful frame illuminated by the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles. He set the unconscious man down on a patch of higher ground, his movements careful but efficient. Then he turned back toward Daniel, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the younger man's precarious position. "You're almost there," Arnold shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "But you've got to move now. The water's rising, and that branch isn't stable." Daniel nodded, though his body felt like it was about to give out. He forced himself to his feet, his hands gripping the branches for support as he climbed over the new barrier. The wood was slick with rain, and every step felt like a battle against gravity and exhaustion. "Come on," Arnold bellowed, his voice a thunderous command. "You're stronger than you think. You can do this." Daniel gritted his teeth, his muscles burning as he climbed over the final stretch of debris. The current was relentless, the floodwaters surging around his legs and threatening to sweep him away. But Arnold's voice was a lifeline, pulling him forward with every word. Just as Daniel reached the edge of the tree, another surge of water hit him, nearly knocking him off balance. He stumbled, his hands slipping on the slick wood as his body lurched sideways. For a terrifying moment, he thought he would fall. But then a massive hand shot out, grabbing him by the arm. "I've got you," Arnold growled, his grip like iron as he pulled Daniel onto solid ground. Daniel collapsed onto the higher ground, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't care. He was out of the water, alive for now. The roar of the storm seemed to recede as Daniel lay on the patch of higher ground, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. The cold, wet ground beneath him felt oddly comforting compared to the chaos of the floodwaters. For the first time in what felt like hours, he wasn't fighting the current or scrambling to stay upright. But his body still trembled, his muscles aching with exhaustion. "Are you okay?" Arnold's deep voice broke through Daniel's haze of exhaustion. The larger man knelt beside him, his sharp eyes scanning Daniel's face for any signs of injury. I think so," Daniel croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat was raw from yelling, his hands scraped and bleeding from gripping the jagged branches of the fallen tree. But he was alive. He nodded weakly. "Thanks to you." Arnold didn't respond immediately. His attention shifted to the unconscious man he had rescued, who now lay a few feet away on the muddy ground. Arnold placed 2 fingers against the man's neck, checking his pulse. Satisfied, he glanced back at Daniel. "You're stronger than you think," he said simply. "Remember that." Daniel managed a faint smile, though the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on him. The storm hadn't just tested his physical limits. It had revealed the cracks in the world around him. His neighbor's betrayal, the realization of how quickly things could fall apart. It was all too much. As Daniel sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his limbs, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. His gaze snapped toward the emergency vehicles, where a small crowd had gathered on the higher ground. Among them, to Daniel's shock, was Carl. His neighbor stood near the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed and his expression guarded. His clothes were dry, and there wasn't a single sign that he had been caught in the floodwaters. Daniel's chest tightened. Carl had made it to safety hours ago, abandoning his home and his neighbor in the process. And now, here he was, watching from the sidelines as Arnold carried people to safety, as others braved the chaos to save lives. The anger that had simmered in Daniel's chest during the flood now began to boil over. Arnold seemed to notice Daniel's shift in focus. He followed the younger man's gaze, his sharp eyes narrowing as they landed on Carl. "Friend of yours?" he asked, though his tone carried a weight of suspicion. "Neighbor," Daniel said bitterly, his voice thick with frustration. "He saw me. He heard me yelling for help. And he didn't do anything." Arnold's jaw tightened, his expression darkening. He stood slowly, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the muddy ground. "Stay here," he said, his tone low but firm. "I'll be back." Daniel didn't argue. He watched as Arnold strode toward the group of emergency responders, his movements deliberate and commanding. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached, his sheer presence enough to draw attention. Even Carl, who had been lingering at the edge of the group, straightened up as Arnold neared him. "You," Arnold said, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. He pointed at Carl, his expression unreadable but intense. "You live here, don't you?" Carl hesitated, his face paling slightly under Arnold's piercing gaze. "Why, yeah," he stammered, his voice shaky. "That's my house over there." Arnold nodded, his eyes narrowing. "And you saw him," he said, jerking his thumb toward Daniel. "You saw your neighbor trapped in the flood, heard him yelling for help. And you did nothing." The crowd fell silent. All eyes turned to Carl, whose face flushed with embarrassment and guilt. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Arnold's presence was as unyielding as the storm, and Carl was caught in the center of it. I didn't know what to do, Carl stammered finally, his voice defensive. It was dangerous out there. I had to think about my own safety. And that's what you chose? Arnold's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made everyone listening uneasy. To leave your neighbor to die so you could stay dry? Carl's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. His gaze darted to the crowd, then back to Arnold. It's not my fault, he muttered. I'm not a firefighter. I'm not trained for this. No, Arnold said, his voice sharp. You're not, but you're human. And part of being human is helping others when they need it. The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes fixed on Carl with a mixture of disappointment and disdain. Carl shrank under their scrutiny, his shoulders hunching as if he could make himself smaller. I didn't know it was that bad, he muttered weakly. You knew enough to leave, Arnold countered, his voice unrelenting. You knew enough to save yourself. But when it came to helping someone else, you turned your back. That's who you are. That's the choice you made. Carl's face turned crimson, his embarrassment now fully on display. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their judgment unmistakable. Carl shuffled backward, his gaze fixed on the ground, unable to meet Arnold's piercing stare. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear. Daniel watched the scene unfold from a distance, a strange mixture of emotions churning in his chest. He felt vindicated, seeing Carl held accountable for his selfishness. But there was also a pang of sadness, an acknowledgement of how easily fear and self-preservation could strip away a person's humanity. Arnold turned back toward Daniel, his expression softening slightly. He walked over to where Daniel sat, crouching down so they were at eye level. You don't need to worry about people like him, Arnold said quietly. What matters is that you're here. You didn't give up, and that's what counts. Daniel nodded, though his throat felt tight. Thank you, he said, his voice trembling. For everything. Arnold gave him a small nod, his hand resting briefly on Daniel's shoulder. Rest up, he said. The storm's not done yet, but you're safe now. Daniel sat on a stretcher, a paramedic wrapping a blanket around his shoulders as he sipped from a steaming cup of tea. His body ached, his hands were raw, and his head swam with exhaustion, but he was alive. He looked over at Arnold, who was speaking with a group of emergency responders, his commanding presence as steady as it had been in the flood. Even now, covered in mud and soaked to the bone, Arnold exuded a quiet strength that reassured everyone around him. Daniel's gaze shifted to Carl, who stood alone near the edge of the group. The man's head was bowed, his posture hunched, as if the weight of the judgment around him was too much to bear. No one spoke to him. No one even looked at him. Carl had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. Arnold broke away from the responders and walked over to Daniel, his movements slow but purposeful. He crouched down so they were eye level, his expression calm but serious. How are you feeling? He asked, his deep voice quieter now, almost gentle. Tired, Daniel admitted, his voice hoarse. He managed a faint smile. But alive. Thanks to you. Arnold nodded, his gaze steady. You fought hard out there, he said. You didn't give up, even when things looked impossible. That's something to be proud of. Daniel looked down at his hands, the words sinking in. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up. Arnold gave him a small, reassuring smile. We're all in this together, he said simply. That's what matters. Daniel nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. He watched as Arnold stood and turned back toward the responders, his work far from finished. More people needed help, more lives needed saving, and Arnold wasn't the kind of man to stop until everyone was safe. As the paramedics began loading Daniel into an ambulance, he looked out at the floodwaters one last time. The storm had revealed a lot about the people around him, both their weaknesses and their strengths. Carl's betrayal still stung, but it was outweighed by the courage and selflessness he had witnessed in Arnold. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were those who would step up, who would fight for others without hesitation. The ambulance doors closed, and Daniel leaned back against the stretcher, his body finally relaxing. The sound of the rain faded into the background as he closed his eyes. The image of Arnold standing tall against the storm etched into his mind. He had seen a hero that day, not the kind from movies or comic books, but a real, living hero who showed him that even in the face of disaster, there was still hope.